support agent, and I'm also joined by Heather Jackson, who's the head of impact investment at Ashburton Investments, and also who is with industry body, the Association of Savings and Investments South Africa, SIDSSA. And maybe, I guess, just to start us off, if we could get some opening remarks about some of the work that your respective organizations are doing in this space, and as a way to, I guess, locate your interest and your participation in this space. And Chris, I'm going to start off with you, and we'll move our way towards Webster and Heather, and then we'll get remarks from Desigan and Dandazo as well. Chris, you seem to be muted.
Muted, sorry. So,
perfect.
Minister, fellow panelists, facilitator, Ayabonga, and listeners across the country, thank you for this opportunity, and allow me to briefly introduce myself as the CEO of Consulting Engineers South Africa. I'm a civil engineer with over 35 years of experience in engineering and management, locally and internationally. My organization has been in existence for 68 years and enjoys a volunteer membership as an industry association in consulting engineering of over 560 companies. In employing indeed over 10,000 engineering professional practitioners. It's always been our intended strategy to, over the past few years, partner with government in delivering excellence in infrastructure. And indeed, I think this is the new dawn. I would like to reiterate, we are a continuously transforming organization with the full awareness of the demographic challenges the construction industry faces, which we deliberately track and encourage our members to embrace as we all become, and all should have been by now, part of what the new South Africa looks like. And in doing this, we have totally reliance on the feedstock for future leadership in our companies, who in essence provide infrastructure solutions and professional services, not only to water, sanitation, and human settlements, but across the spectrum of infrastructure. And I'd like to close here by just saying that our member companies are ready and eager to get into action in providing the requisite expertise with the integrity at this most exciting time. Thank you.
Chris, thank you very much for that input, and I certainly could see how eager your organization is, because I allowed you to skip the queue, and allow me maybe to rectify that and bring up Mr. Tati, who is with us this afternoon on behalf of the Minister of Water and Sanitation. Mr. Sizwe, the platform is yours, and if we could get some opening remarks, and if you could just also give us a brief sense of your role as well, close as it is, of course, to the infrastructure development framework. Mr. Tati?
Sorry, I was muted. Good afternoon to all members of the panel, to you, Ayabonga. As I indicated, probably in our dry run, I'm coming as chairperson of National Housing Finance Corporation, albeit having to represent the minister. So everything that I'll be putting forward today is more from the perspective of the department. It carries two portfolios. It is water and sanitation, as well as the human settlement part. And I propose to split even those presentations so that I don't overlap on them. I'll start with the water side and then subsequently deal with issues that I expected from a human settlement point of view. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Tati, for that. Let me bring up Mr. Webster, who's the CEO of Consulting Engineers South Africa, to introduce himself.
Thank you, presenter and fellow South Africans. I'm Webster, the CEO of the South African Forum of Civil Engineering Contractors. SAFSEC, an 81-year-old industry body for civil engineering contractors, whose members are the biggest investors in the construction, capital expenditure and skills development in the country. For an example, of the total of 4 construction subsectors in our country, our constituency, roads and civils, contribute 70% of skills development levies to the construction sector. As civil engineering contractors, we permeate every aspect of societal life by providing solutions to the developmental needs of humanity. We build South Africa's civil infrastructure. We build roads, bridges, tunnels, and railway systems that connect communities and economies. We build airports, dry and seaports, oil, gas, electricity facilities that drive commerce and industry. Most importantly, for this panel discussion, we build water and sanitation systems that are vital in the restoration of human dignity to sustain lives and livelihoods in order to avert preventable disease and death, and recognize water and sanitation as a basic human right that is also a key resource that drives the country's economy. Adequate water and sanitation services are even more critical and urgent under the current COVID environment. We also build foundations and structures and all the hidden underbelly civil services of every human settlement in residential and commercial buildings. According to the World Economic Forum globally, 8 out of 10 risks over the next 10 years are environmental, with the water crisis featuring prominently. Lastly, the water crisis is also among the top 5 short-term risks, with 86% of respondents expecting it to increase in 2020. This is very bad news given the COVID-19 pandemic. We need to act collectively now, and the civil engineering contractors are pivotal in the delivery of infrastructure that sustains lives and livelihoods. Thank you.
Mr. Mfebe, thank you very much for those remarks. And I guess it makes for a perfect segue into answering the question of how do we finance some of this. And we joined for our panel as well by Ms. Heather Jackson, Head of Impact Investment at Ashburton Investments, and also a member of SIDSSA. Heather, afternoon to you, and please introduce yourself.
Thank you, Ayabonga. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm looking really forward to this panel discussion. I think it's a critical time for us to forge ways of working in collaborative partnership between public and private. And I'm happy to say we've been doing that for quite a number of years. So I'm looking forward to sharing some of those experiences and what I think is possible in the sector. But I wear 2 hats. So firstly, representing our savings industry body, SIDSSA, and then as an impact investor at Ashburton, we've built up some of these blended finance strategies over the years. I must say that for those of us who've been working through SIDSSA for many years now to tackle the challenges across infrastructure that we know we have in South Africa, we've worked with the PICC, NEDLAC, and others over the years. And I must say many of my industry colleagues are saying that this SIDS drive feels different. Like this is, I guess we're all responding to many crises, and that this is really a serious move and with serious intent and commitment. So yeah, really looking forward, excuse me, to this discussion. We are working on a very exciting initiative that is specifically related to the water and sanitation sector at the moment, and I look forward to sharing some more of that with you.
Thank you very much for that, Heather. I'm now going to call up from, I guess, one of the foremost organizations in our national system of innovation, the Water Research Commission. Their CEO, Desigan Naidu. Desigan, platform is yours to introduce yourself.
Thank you, sir. It's lovely to see you, Ayabonga, and greetings to all the panelists. And it's a privilege for this roundtable sponsored by Minister Sisulu. My name is Desigan Naidu. I'm from the Water Research Commission. It's an old institution in this country. It's part of the family of science councils. It's all of 49 years old this year. And for the past 26 years, we have played quite a pivotal role and a very proud role to contribute to the development of this new democracy. By definition, our business is research and innovation. We want to organize for knowledge-driven solutions to many of our problems and challenges, but we want to go beyond that. We want to organize for the innovation to lead into business development, to lead into the possibility of new industrial platforms, and transform our water and sanitation landscape in the country. We work very closely to both the departments under Minister Sisulu, but also many other departments in government, as well as the private sector. And the key idea is to organize ourselves to take this very successful enterprise that we've had for many years in South Africa around water, because we have water security in a very arid country, but take it to the next level of water security, the next level of dignified sanitation services in the context of the 21st century around the new solutions and around the new possibilities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Desigan, for that. Let me call up now from the Municipal Infrastructure Support Agent, Mr. Ntandazo Vimba, and they do a lot of interesting work in trying to extend capacity and capability on many of the infrastructure projects undertaken at that level. Mr. Vimba, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Facilitator. Good day to my fellow panelists. My name is Ntandazo Vimba. As you have indicated, Mr. Facilitator, I'm the CEO of MISA. Briefly, MISA is a fairly young agency of government. It's a government component which was set up following a comprehensive assessment of the state of local government in 2008 and 2009, which culminated to the adoption by Cabinet of what was called the local government turnaround strategy. In that strategy, there were a number of interventions that government set to do. And one of those interventions was the capacity support organization that must be set up to support municipalities, in particular to close the gap that was identified as it relates to the engineering capacity and technical skills in general in municipalities. So MISA's mandate was therefore to make sure that we support municipalities with infrastructure planning, infrastructure delivery, infrastructure operations and maintenance, and we also build internal capacity of municipalities so that they can on their own deliver infrastructure in a more sustainable way. All in all, Chair, we support municipalities at all stages of the municipal infrastructure life cycle. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Mr. Vimba. And I guess that in a way sets out who is part of our conversation here. We also have about 70 or so people who are joining us as attendees for this conversation, and a big welcome to them all. And we will certainly encourage many of them to send through their question and answer, or their questions, I should rather say, to some of our panelists, and even comments. Please feel free to do so on the Q&A tab. You have a 256 character limit. It's probably, I think, a bit higher than what you would find on Twitter, but we probably don't want the kind of contentious and combative debate that one would find on that particular platform. But that being said, I think a lot of the context of why we are having this conversation in the current moment relates to COVID-19 in the first instance, where a big part of the precautionary measures are contingent on being able to have access to sanitation, have access to, I guess, a shelter. You can't, quarantine or isolate, I guess, in a context where people don't have access to shelter. And then, of course, there are the main challenges around accessing water, which is a critical part of the response. But also, many of the things we're going to be talking about today are part of the constitutional promise of our breakthrough in 1994. And I think if we think about that in that context, and also in the context that a lot of the infrastructure we're talking about, a lot of expectations when it comes to jobs, and many of my panelists would have seen the quarterly labor force numbers that came out earlier on today, continuing to add to the bad news about the absorptive nature of our economy, or lack thereof. And Chris, I want to maybe start off here with you. And maybe before we go to you, Chris, it might be helpful to bring in Usizwe to this question, because I guess in the context we find ourselves in with the constitutional promise that we have, Mr. Tati, what are some of the things that have happened since there's been, I guess, a merger of the Department of Human Settlements and Water and Sanitation? And maybe if you could speak to us about some of the infrastructure projects that are underway, all of which that are really aimed at not only improving the long-run growth potential of our economy, but also ensuring that we extend a dignified life to many of our people where they need it the most.
Thank you, Ayabong. I guess it's still important, even though we might all be conscious of the broad scheme of arrangements, that South Africa is facing a serious water crisis that is caused by the insufficiency of water infrastructure from a maintenance, investment point of view, but it's exacerbated by the recurrent droughts that are driven by the global climatic variations. There's also a further problem of inequities in access to water and sanitation. The quality of the water is not up to scratch, not to speak about the lack of skills in the sector in terms of engineering, scientists, hydrologists, geohydrologists, and resource economists. I won't complete in my assessment if I don't mention the huge problem of corruption and gross mismanagement, especially at the local government level. And then you have COVID-19, which really pushes the crisis to unmeasurable proportions. I thought it's very important that we all have the context of that background. The other part, really, when you look into where we are in the future, there is an increase in the water demand because of the growing urbanization, our growing population, there are changing lifestyles, and in general, from an industrial point of view, the growth in the economy. All of these put pressure on this very scarce resource of water. I've touched on the climate change, weather is becoming warmer and drier, and all these contexts put together, it put a serious stress on a limited resource. Climate change, that there will be less water available to meet the needs of the people. To date, if I may just mention as well, we have over 3 million people without access to basic water supply in the country. And only 64% of households have reliable water supply. That shows you the gap in all those facets. At a municipal level, the gap between requirements and supply is driven by inefficient use, the water losses, which is wastage and leakage, inadequate cost recovery, overconsumption, inappropriate infrastructure choices, aging infrastructure. I did touch on the corruption and the gross mismanagement issue. If some of you might recall, in November 2019, the minister launched a National Water and Sanitation Master Plan. In developing that master plan for the country, the department had realized the importance that water plays in the whole economic and social value chain. The master plan, therefore, it articulates an extensive set of actions and investments that the country's water sector must implement between now and 2030 to achieve water security for the country, including equitable access to water, sanitation services for all South Africans, as you mentioned, Chairperson, in terms of the constitutional imperative. The water and sanitation sector currently is not financially sustainable. Therefore, funding needs are on the increase, and the available funds, as we all know, especially from the pressure of the fiscus, are very limited. This stress on resources is not just local, it's also from the international perspective, where there's reduced revenues, there's accumulated debt by the government, and all of these put pressure to minimize what is available to put into this sector. And that emphasizes how private sector and public sector need to collaborate. Funding of the water sector comprises, as we might all be aware, the capital part of the infrastructure development. There's operational costs, there's maintenance along the supply chain, as well as the funding for the governance, in other words, administrative and control part, for the effective management of the sanitary services. Capital requirements of the sector, in our estimate, approximate 90 billion per annum. This comprises about 70 billion of water supply infrastructure from source to end user, and about 20 billion for sanitation and wastewater collection and treatment. In 2018, the government estimated the gap at 333 billion over the next 10 years between the funding requirements, which is 898 billion, that is available, against the available 565. This funding gap needs to be reduced through a very purposeful intervention, such as the policy reviews, enhanced regulation, implementation of cost efficiency measures, proper management, and the user expectation demands. Further, given the limited public funding that is available through government budget, it's important to ensure that financially viable projects are financed using private sector funding. This will allow our public funds to be focused on priority transformation projects. The interventions to do this will build on the success to date of the Trans-Caledon Tunnel Authority and the water boards, which together have in the past mobilized significant loan finance to undertake infrastructure development to supply urban and as well as industrial activity. To strengthen the activity to raise private sector funding, the establishment of the National Water Resource Infrastructure Agency is being proposed. This would combine the operational activities of the National Department, the funding and the developmental capabilities of the Trans-Caledon Tunnel Authority, and enable funding to be raised on the basis of the sectoral substantial balance sheet. Now, in order to do this, experiences show that the necessary plan for the next 10 to 20 years ahead of the successfully address climate variability, change as well as the intervention needed to support our growing water needs. We are in the process of reviewing and prioritizing the implementation of the strategic water resource development projects, as well as expediting the development of planned ongoing national infrastructure to ensure a timely completion to maintain the water security of urban economic centers such as the Gauteng region, eThekwini, Nelson Mandela Bay, Cape Town. These projects, just to name a few of them, are Mokolo Crocodile West Water Augmentation Project, Mzimvubu Water Project, Mnawitwa Tsanin Augmentation Project, Foyles Drift Dam, the Val Kamakhara Water Augmentation Project. I hope I've got that pronunciation right. Lesotho Highlands Water Project Phase 2, Umkomazi Water Project, and Bergrefil Full Flow Augmentation Scheme. Now, the implementation of the action plan of the program that comes from what was launched in November last year has the following components. The Trans-Caledon Tunnel Authority has already been mandated through ministerial directives to serve as the funding and liability manager for the following projects, which are implementation ready and prioritized for private sector funding. The Lesotho Highlands Water Phase 2, 32 billion project. This will augment the supply to the VAL system to specifically meet the increasing water demand from Gauteng and other downstream users. Phase 2A of the Mokolo Crocodile River Augmentation Project. It's a 12.4 billion project. This will increase water supply for energy generation, the Medupi Power Station, the coal mining project, and phase 1 of this project is already in operation, commissioned in 2014. Project consists of an abstraction way, 160 kilometer water transfer pipeline with capacity of 75 million cubic square meter per annum. And then you've got Umkomazi Water Project. It's a 23.2 billion. This one augments water supply to eThekwini Metropolitan. You'll be aware that the recent droughts in the area further expose the current lack of resilience of the Mgeni system, that's increasing the need for this project. Then you've got Bergvlei Full Flow Augmentation Scheme. It's a 798 million project. This one will increase the water security to the city of Cape Town. This transfer scheme will ensure that the winter rainfall runoff will augment storage in the existing full-fledged dam. The city and irrigators in the Berg will benefit from this project. This is, Chairperson, just to mention a few of the specific projects. I don't know what you prefer, because that's the end on the sanitary part, whether I should proceed on to the human settlements. I'll be guided by you.
Please proceed on to the human settlements, and then we'll continue with Chris thereafter. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry. Now, the Department of Human Settlements, Water Sanitation, as we all know, plays a contributory role in the post-COVID economy. Almost 4 million houses benefited by the state since the new democracy. And there's another 2 million that is still to be built. Housing construction can be used as a great lever to radically transform the economy and the lives of millions of South Africans, led up to mainstream economy as we all for historical reasons. However, combined impact of the economic downturn has created, as well as COVID-19, has created an unprecedented challenge for human settlement, which requires some out-of-the-box thinking. We don't waste much time, but we all know the contribution of human settlement and the construction industry in relation to the production of housing, to the GDP, housing improvements and additions. They also contribute to the GDP, job creation, the financial impact from both the leverage from the financial system, rates and taxes. And there's also indirect benefit, as we all know, simply from the social well-being of families. There is a very illustrative project, which is very important to highlight if anybody wants to look at what kind of infrastructure and human settlement this country desires most to create better impact. The Waterfall Park, which is a mixed-use, mixed-income mega residential strategically located between trade and employment corridor of Midrand and Parktown. I don't want to bore you with the statistics there, but if you really Google on that project, you will see how much the human settlement from an infrastructure impact point of view can seriously leverage. The South African property market is about 6.1 households valued at over 4 trillion rands. Nearly 4 million households have benefited since the new government has come into power. In fact, there is evidence in the Lightstone research, which is the deeds office data, confirms that less than 3% of the sub 200,000 market segment is actually bonded. Now that shows you the extent of the opportunity that sits there. From a broader market segmentation point of view, just to give you some few statistics, in the range of 600,000 house values and above, you have 42% of the total of the people who have been housed in the country coming from that category. And that represents 80% of the rent value on that side. And then on the households, house structures of between 400 and 600, 13% of the population has benefited. That represents only 9% of the rent value. 300 to 400, only 9%. 200,000 to 300,000, only 10%. And then less than 200 is 26%. You could easily see the gap that remains, that the vast part of the population of the country still has or living without shelter. The government faces a very huge challenge in the post-COVID world, where it still has to deliver almost 2 million houses as part of this constitutional mandate. The National Development Plan has identified several formidable challenges confronting human settlements, which must be addressed as part of a comprehensive plan to achieve this goal. It talks to well-located land is still expensive. Urban planning and approval processes are still slow. Affordability constraints in the marketplace from a financial access point of view. There are other factors, which I'm not gonna bore you so much about. The lack of the secondary housing market is an example in the townships, which shows you how underleveraged the housing stock that sits in the townships still remains today. the new housing programs that have had very low economic scale. Those are some of the challenges which typically one would drill deeper if the time was available. Now, the department has taken a view to prioritize some housing programs. Some of these relate out of the 18 programs identified. Because of the pressing economic challenges now, the department has reduced these to 4 aligned to the areas of the greatest need. One, the informal settlements upgrading. Second is the social housing space. The other one, the need to really have shelters and opportunities which are enhancing benefits and opportunities to women and people who come from the previously disadvantaged environment. The first-time homeowners, this is a significant market which is not addressed given the risk aversion of some of the financial institutions. Just to touch on the other policy challenges, the department recognizes that it needs to review the Home Loan and Mortgage Disclosure Act in order to review even the financial services charter targets that have been set for the banks, because we realize the environment has shifted and the pressures have become even much more acute. The department recognizes that it must review the approach to finance-linked individual subsidy program, so-called FLIPS program, because less than 5% of customers, as we have researched, are still benefit from this program, and yet its potential is far larger than that. We need to remove the 8-year moratorium on breaking new ground, stock that is not conducive to mobilizing capital and wealth. You know that limitation that once you've benefited through that program, you have to keep for a period of about 8 years. The other part is really recycling and unlocking debt capital in the RDP and banking new ground programs. Other opportunities still sit in the inner city building projects, the abandoned buildings, as well as the commercial buildings. A huge opportunity sits there, refocus the ambitious mega city projects to include the rejuvenation of inner city. We also see a leverage of pension funds as alternative forms of funding for human settlement. Pension funds are significant investors in commercial property. The example of rates, some of you might know. These pension funds could provide a very strong collateral for individuals in the housing loan schemes. So there's a huge potential for them. The other part the department has been embarking on is the restructuring of the human settlement entities. We are proposing the establishment of a mega development housing functionary. In other words, an enlarged housing development agency. Some of you who are closer to the industry will know about this institution. The department believes its role could be much more, expanded, especially with enhanced authority given to it. Creating a single human settlement regulatory authority, putting together the estate agency board, the CSOS, SHRA. The department views it is cumbersome and quite expensive to have all these regulatory bodies in their singular form, and there could be benefits if they are amalgamated. To create an architecture for human settlement financial model with the envisaged Human Settlement Development Board as the apex housing DFI that will consolidate the finance amongst all the other entities. In this respect, we want National Housing Finance, NHBRC, and SRA to find mechanisms of leveraging the capital and their balance sheets to make it available to expand the human settlement investment in the sector. I don't want to get into the detail of the apex institution, which has been highlighted in my presentation, unless questions come so that I can deal with them. But it is important to highlight that we view the PPPs, private-public sector partnership, as pivotal. The state has long realized, including this department, that on its own, it doesn't have sufficient resources to make an impact. And therefore, a partnership and a viable and sustainable one, long-term, with the private sector is the key. In conclusion, there's no doubt that the housing construction and investment can act as a stimulus to the economy whilst contributing to greater socio-economic political stability. The production of houses for ownership and rental, the huge opportunity, there's job creation that will come with investment in human settlement. We want to encourage the collaboration with private sector. We also want to promote the cultural mix and diversity so that when we create areas of human settlement, they're not on the basis of the historical, spatial income gaps, but to find communities that can intermeddle and promote social cohesion. Chairperson, let me stop at that level. Thank you very much.
Mr. Tati, thank you very much for that. And certainly from the questions that are coming through, many questions and comments emerging there, and we'll certainly try and pick out some of those and engage them. But thank you very much for those remarks. And I think it comes at a very interesting moment. We've got the special adjustment budget coming through in the next day or so, which is certainly set to have major implications on many of the areas that Mr. Tati was speaking about. We saw in February a 1.6 billion rand reduction in the water services infrastructure grant and about 6 billion rand or so for the urban human settlements grant, which also includes the upgrade of informal settlements. So the big question is, are we going to see a continuation of some of these reductions, and what is all of that going to mean? And we'll come back to some of those questions. At this point, I want to bring in Chris Campbell. And Chris, you would have heard what Mr. Tati was speaking to and would be familiar with some of the big questions there. And I guess one of the issues that's come out quite strongly from a National Planning Commission report on infrastructure was this challenge of built environment professionals like yourselves, and I guess the paucity or lack of them in many of our municipalities that are charged with delivering this infrastructure.
Thanks, Ayabonga.
Let's try and unmute you there, Chris. Yeah? Sure, perfect.
Okay, thank you. I think listening to the comments from the ministry, I think, I'd like to start just with a headline, for instance, before I go into the capacity challenges and what creates them is that, much as we could go into some of the technical detail, I think at the heart of the water and sanitation problem, as well as the human settlements, is key issues around sustainability and quality. And likewise in human settlements, for example, we often talk about affordability, but we don't think about sustainability. And I'll unpack that a little bit more later, but it comes back to quality. Now, where am I heading with this? Our procurement systems, as we run them at the moment, unfortunately, in the infrastructure development process, you start with your built environment professionals, and we put so much energy into trying to discount the services of professionals, something you'd never do to your medical practitioner. And we expect innovative solutions, quality solutions, and the like. And we invariably, much as the integrity of the professional is on the line, there's levels of affordability. So you may find that you probably get just about what you've paid for. And we really need to get back to a system of procuring services in our infrastructure development process, both in human settlements, in water and sanitation, where we consider that we're going to own this as a country for the next 30, 40 years. So you look at it from a total cost of ownership. At the moment, 2% of that cost is attributed to your professional services, and we put the most energy into it. We have bucket loads of contract documents and papers and tender preparations, and we don't realize that at the tail end, operation and maintenance, which if I take 20% as being construction, that leaves you with another 78% in operation and maintenance costs over the life of the infrastructure, which you're going to end up maintaining more frequently because your starting point was wrong. So we should be looking at how do we commission the services of our built environment practitioners where we value their services, that it's equal to the innovative solutions and the creativity that we're going to need to be able to do more with less. Then, going into the capacity issues, at the moment, a large amount of the engineering capacity does sit in the private sector. The private sector have offered that partnership over a couple of years already, and one understands that during the dark times, one might have been a little bit more apprehensive about doing so. But I think moving forward now, it makes more sense to use the private sector interchangeably. Let's not in a non-corrupt, well-governed manner, to supplement and complement the capacity that sits in the state, and also to develop capacity that should then reside within the state for the future. Now, some of the own goals we're scoring here is we're rapidly killing off an industry. Simple things like payment. There are large companies and small companies who are bleeding, not even COVID-19 related, but well over 120 days of outstanding payment for their services. And this is ongoing. So, no business can remain afloat at that rate. I spoke about the onerous tender procedures. If we are going to get this right, then we've got to look at the cost of doing business. And by this, I mean, if companies have to duplicate the amount of paperwork, the amount of effort in responding to bids, where every municipality, every department tend to differ, it's an unnecessary waste of resources. So we need to look at how do we streamline that. I know entities like Sandra are looking at more condensed processes, and maybe more should exercise that thinking. And then one of the other issues, which is an unintended consequence of our budgeting process. Most infrastructure projects are not done and dusted in 3 years. You may start the design in year 1, and then you have possibly inefficient statutory approvals, such as what use licensing, EIAs. That chews up all your time, and because we tend to have a medium-term expenditure framework which extends over 3 years, the contract with the service provider gets terminated, but the project's not finished. We've had instances where, for instance, I know this is water and sanitation, but the analogy here is the road hasn't gotten to the bridge yet, but the contract has been terminated. And we need to rethink that and appreciate the infrastructure true period of construction and build in the efficiencies in the regulatory process. I spoke earlier in my introduction about it's important that we eradicate corruption, both within the private sector as well as in the public sector, because that just sets us back all of the time. And, as an organization, we've upped our ante on that. And, we would certainly would not hesitate to reconsider members as part of our fold if they are found guilty of that kind of behavior. And then, in terms of creating capacity building, we must consider doing it different to the way it was done previously. In the previous pursuits under a different leadership, the notion of creating capacity was appointing a small company, and then the company invariably ended up farming that work out to larger companies. Now, could you create capacity that way? No. So what you need is companies with capacity and know-how to bring on board other companies and build a new capability for the future, with a strong emphasis on women in our industry, because there's a dire shortage. Your engineering council stats of registered engineering female practitioners, you're talking about 8% compared to 8% female compared to 92% male. In our industry, we've got 24% women in senior leadership positions as opposed to 76% male. So I think we do need to put a stronger emphasis on that. And then I think finally, if we look at our housing, it becomes very important that, and I mentioned earlier, that we don't just look at affordability, we must look at sustainability. Because much as affordability means that people can afford it at the capital value, But if there's not been enough oversight, not enough proper design and construction, then you compromise the sustainability of that structure, and some unwitting family who now, for the first time has a house, finds them having to spend a whole lot of money doing high-level maintenance because the house starts cracking up because the foundation's settling when it shouldn't. So, you know, those are key things. And then I think finally, because I'm mindful of my time allocation, in our endeavors here, I believe that as a country and through water and sanitation, human settlements, and in other infrastructure developments, we must get away from this feast and famine cycle. Because much like we led up to 2010, 3 years, too much work, complaints of not enough capacity, and then boom, nothing. We need to see this as a scaled up, ongoing, long-term process, so we never end up with unemployed graduates who've gone and studied 4 hard years doing engineering, finding themselves unemployed, and likewise having our construction companies and consulting companies rapidly going out of business. I think I'm going to end there. Thank you.
Chris, thank you very much for that input there. And I think you raise a lot of site level and even more macro issues that I certainly hope we can return to, and some of the questions that are starting to come through, many of the other participants picking up on some of the issues that you're raising. I want to bring in now from the Water Research Commission, the CEO, Desigan Naidu, and they do, as I said earlier on, some fascinating work in our national system of innovation, and we're a water-scarce country, and certainly a research institution that has allowed us to at least have some sense of water security over many decades as a country subject to persistent droughts. And Desigan, the platform is yours, and I certainly hope that you can certainly take us through some ideas about how we think and answer the call the President made earlier on to also, as we expand access to water, also do so in a way that innovates as well. Desigan Naidu.
Thank you, Ayabonga, and thank you for those presentations from Sizwe and Chris as well. I want to take you on a little journey, which is a little bit away from what we've been talking about, because we need to talk about possibility. But first, I just want to emphasize this point, that this moment that we're sitting in is an incredibly difficult moment in the world. COVID-19 has reorganized our thinking, it's reorganized our lenses, it's reorganized our aspirations, but it has provided a crisis point that we should not organize to miss, because this crisis should work for us. The really thing I want to emphasize is that we have an almost perfect storm that we're looking at in 2020. You know, while we've had this unwelcome disruptor called COVID-19, this is now complementing the serious crises that were already there. We continue to be in the middle of a climate crisis in the world. There are many commentators that say that we haven't really recovered from 2008 yet, and we are in a much bigger hole than we were ever before. And people are now talking about the parallels between 2020 and the Great Depression. And if this is not enough, the multilateral system is under threat in the most serious way. And the trade wars are simply not assisting us to get to the places that we want to be. So this lays out, if you like, the context around which we need to work. But, you know, I come from the Water Research Commission, and science institutions are engulfed with optimism generally and examine what possibilities might exist. So we should take those same challenges that we have and flip that cone around and look at the cone of opportunity. Because on the back of innovative responses in the human settlement sector, in the water and sanitation sector, we can organize ourselves to get to this point of national self-sufficiency. In fact, UN Water is now talking about this notion in the United Nations system of 2023, the Agenda 2023, around accelerating into the SDGs rather than retarding away from the development targets. But in addition to national self-sufficiency, South Africa knows more than most other people in the world the real importance of operating as a region, that the international partnership is absolutely paramount. And on the back of the national self-sufficiency, we can organize ourselves into a regional economic guild And Ayabonga, this will tickle your fancy. This is a good route to global competitiveness and partnership. So what is this based on? So the work that we do in the water and sanitation sector, together with all of our partners, and we have tremendous partners, and I'll talk about them just now, one of the main theaters of operation of all of these new innovations that we're trying to put into the system is, of course, the human settlements domain. And the goal is, as the previous speakers have pointed out, to organize for sustainable human settlements that have the ability to see to many of their securities within the borders of that municipality and reduce our ecological footprint into the rural areas. So a couple of these components, which you'll be very familiar with. One is this notion of water-sensitive design. Designing not with the roads first, as many of the designs work, but organized to work with what resource availability you have in the system, and organized for the system to organize itself in a way that increases its security rather than decrease its security. Alongside this comes the notion of very smart wastewater management. In fact, our wastewater treatment plants are in fact the energy plants of the future. And we have a really powerful network of water boards in the sector, as you will well know, and these places serve as test beds for us around the new technologies that we want to put into the system. And if I can point out one example, the headquarters of Bloom Water, which is based in Bloemfontein, does not run on the Eskom grid anymore. It actually utilizes the conduit hydropower from the water system to run the entire headquarter needs for energy inside Bloom Water. This is remarkable, and it's been internationally acknowledged as well. Then there's the issue of supply diversification. For far too long, we have been concentrating only on organizing to extract water from the river system, the surface water in particular. We're now pushing that envelope to include much more groundwater into that system, to include land management as one of the major contributors to the water security of the system. And we know we can do it because we've done it during the drought, and we compare our numbers to the global numbers. The global average for use per person per day is 177 liters. South Africa, as the 30th driest country in the world, is at 253. We are a wasteful nation. So our water security depends on us, both with the diversification as well as much more controlled use. Then there's the issue of water quality. Because while all of the risk registers are talking about the notion of water crisis as to the availability of the quantity of water, the reality is particular quality, otherwise we can't use it at all. So the water quality environment becomes absolutely pivotal. Into this mix, we put in the idea of synergies between sectors. And this is the water, energy, food nexus, which is something the WRC is currently leading. There's the whole notion of new sanitation. The WRC and South Africa can proudly count themselves as part of the leadership in the world with the Reinvent the Toilet program sponsored by the Gates Foundation, and more recently organizing for new standards to enable us to move in space. And there is, of course, the industrial revolution. And I think there's a reasonable argument to be made that we have been thrust into this fourth industrial revolution in a most dramatic way from a most unexpected source, and that's a little coronavirus called COVID-19. We are in that world right now. So why am I confident that this can actually happen? Well, because we have a highly productive team in this country in the domain of water research and innovation. Universities in the system, all of the public research institutes, and many private institutes as well. And I'm very happy to say that although this community of practice is really small, we're talking about 3,000 full-time equivalent researchers, we rank in the top 20 in the world with regards to production of this new knowledge. So this innovation organizes for us, one, to get to the point of much more sustainable human settlements. But two, it gives us a very specific advantage point in the world, because COVID did what 50 years of negotiations in the United Nations could not do. It has flattened the landscape. It has organized to drastically create the opportunity to change the patterns of consumption and production in the world. We have the possibility as a country, we have the possibility as a continent to become one of the major production centers in the world. And this must talk to the kinds of infrastructure that we need. So colleagues, this new industry platform is something that is promising. And we are in the month of June in this country where we talk about youth and we remember 1976. This is a eureka moment for youth leadership. And maybe this is the antidote to the stats that we heard earlier today around the labor force reports. But there are many dimensions of this. Is around the new innovations, the new know-how, but it has to be supported by a system. And part of that system, and one of the advantages we can use, are the issues around standards and certification. This is a very quiet revolution that is led by innovation, but one I think we need to make a lot more noise about. So the WRC in South Africa, together with the SABS, was part of a small consortium of countries that organized to engage one of the promising things that we have in our system. If we want to extend that SDG 6.2 target to the point of universal access to safe sanitation in the world, it's not going to be on the back of waterborne sewage systems. They're far too capital intensive on the one hand, and two, they use a huge amount of water and we don't have a lot of that. So the non-sanitation work has been going on for many years. The thing that has prevented it from getting into the marketplace is the lack of a standard. Countries were not willing to go that extra mile. So this consortium of players organized to develop an ISO standard, an ISO standard 3500 for non-sewage sanitation. And South Africa followed very quickly. And the SABS is organized to make us only the second country in the world to have a national standard. And this is SANS 3500. And these kinds of enabling factors in the environment will be what organizes for us to have the industrial platforms that we desire. Then the last thing I want to emphasize in this presentation is that we must use our science to good use. So one of the more important contributions around our COVID status in this country, around getting past this epidemic, is the ability to use wastewater as a community level marker for the occurrence of the virus and the infections. The basic idea is to pick up the mRNA, an indicator of the presence of the coronavirus, amplify a level where you can see the signals and then monitor the system and create a heat map for the country as a whole, which tells you where the hotspots are, just testing the wastewater. And this allows you in a triage mechanism for the health workers to go in and do the one-on-one in where the hotspots are in the country. But more important than that, it allows us a surveillance tool to see how our interventions are working around us. And we want to see how this heats up in various centers, how this moves along the world on this map. And eventually, the success of the intervention should organize for us to see a cooling down of that heat map as we're moving into the future. But that is not enough to get as a dividend for what we want to do, because the back end of this is to organize for the structure of the water quality monitoring system in the country as a whole. Because we don't only have to worry about the COVID virus, we have to worry about the general pollutants that are increasing with time, as well as the hormonal treatments. So we need a national system to be able to organize to engage all of these matters. Now, why is this all important? Because, as was said earlier, one of the top 5 risks in the global risk register for the last 9 years in a row has been this issue around the water crisis and the various dimensions of the nature of the water crisis. So the ability to provide water security in the system will not only help us to build a water industry in the country, as envisaged by the IPAP chapter on water and sanitation, but more than that, it de-risks the other investments that need to happen inside the system for us to be able to build the kind of industrial framework that we want inside this country. And this extends beyond ourselves. One of the core points of Agenda 2023 as a continental plan is this grounding in innovation, this grounding on knowledge-driven solutions, this grounding in high-level capacities that we create inside the system to be able to move the system along. And the last point I want to make is that we're sitting at a moment in history which is incredibly ironic. In the world today, not just in South Africa, what we saw in the labor force survey in South Africa is replicated all around the world. We have the highest level of skill in our unemployed cohort in the world today. We certainly have that in this 30-odd% in this country as we sit today. It is our business to create the right kinds of opportunities to start industrializing water and sanitation, putting people to work, increasing our water security, increasing our investment potential, increasing our direct earnings from the global markets. So, Chair, with those couple of words, I will rest there. Thank you very much indeed.
Desigan, thank you very much for those remarks and giving us certainly a lot to ponder and think about. Certainly, least of all, I mean, from the regulatory perspective, and I'm still quite shocked that it took us as long as it did to just sort out the standards issue, and maybe that's a theme we can return to. Now, a big chunk of what the President spoke to earlier on this morning was about getting collaboration in funding, not only funding, but even building and operating a public infrastructure. And my next guest is certainly somebody who has been part of many of these conversations over many years. Her name is Ms. Heather Jackson, and she's the head of impact investment at Ashburton Investments, and also somebody working quite closely with the industry body SIDSSA on some of these questions. Heather, the platform is yours.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm just struggling a little bit to share.
So I think you are the presenter, so you should be able to share.
Yes, there we go.
Cool.
Okay, is that working? Are you seeing that presentation?
Yes, we can. Yeah, we can see your screen.
Okay, great. Sure, Desigan, that was quite a depressing note to end on. I was not aware that we had the most skilled component to our unemployment rate, which is already the highest in the world. But as you say, the optimists amongst us will say, don't waste a good crisis and don't waste that kind of opportunity. And I certainly subscribe to that. And thank you to all the panelists. It's great to see that there's so much activity happening in the space. I think you're absolutely right that we need more innovation, and hopefully the kinds of this crisis really is the impetus that we need to actually find more creative solutions. I do think as an industry we sometimes lack imagination, and that that can't be too difficult to fix. And when the demands are upon us in the way that they are, then hopefully it just takes us up several notches that we need to bandy together, to work together to figure out solutions. So I think, like many things, the current crisis is highlighting unsustainable trends that were already happening. I mean, this image is back from 2014, and it's exceptionally bad, or was as it was. But it's also certainly highlighting and heightening the urgency for government and private sector to work together more effectively to forge a more inclusive growth path. I think and many of us have alluded to it, we already knew we had the highest unemployment rate and amongst the most unequal societies in the world going into this COVID crisis. We've also had plenty of evidence of crumbling infrastructure and enormous challenges in sectors like our water and sanitation, our human settlements, which is also, of course, so crucial for our health response. And they're all integrally linked. And so where I'm coming from is I believe that impact investing and especially blended finance solutions can really help to solve many of these challenges. So these are surmountable. Blended finance, if I could just go to the next slide, is defined by the OECD as the strategic use of government development finance for the mobilization of additional private finance towards the sustainable development goals in developing countries. And really the glue for these kinds of blended finance solutions is an alignment, a recognition between both the public and the private partners that recognize that we need to do more towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. And of course, as we all know, these are very closely mapped to our own National Development Plan. Investments and areas that work towards these development goals in social infrastructure, be it in better access to healthcare, clean water, education, and affordable housing, have been predominantly left in the hands of governments, I think, especially the large infrastructure projects, and as well as the development banks like our DBSA. And yet we know, and this is a global phenomenon, but I think it's accentuated here, that this source of funding is both insufficient and unsustainable. And where we come along as impact investors working in these blended finance strategies is we say we can work with a development bank, for example, and packaged correctly and providing attractive risk and reward characteristics. These are investment areas that can see much more private sector investment. So coming from the likes of your pension funds, and not necessarily only local pension funds, insurers, long-dated entities who require those kind of long-term steady returns that infrastructure can deliver on. So we know that climate change will disproportionately affect those at the base of the economic pyramid. And as we are experiencing with the coronavirus-related deaths and job losses, unfortunately, the same is true in this pandemic. The crisis has really urgently highlighted the case for more purpose-driven, inclusive finance across both environmental and social sectors. And this is, of course, core to impact investing. So I just want to give you a couple of practical examples, because I think, I listened to some of the speakers in the plenary session earlier, and I could not agree more that we need to focus. It's no good kind of having a big, broad, spray and pray approach. I think we need to be focused, and we need to be bringing in, and some of the panelists here, the engineering components, the water boards, government certainly, private sector across the gamut of banks, fund managers, pension funds, insurers, and so and I know from experience, these are not simple matters. Putting together blended finance solutions are complex, challenging, iterative, sometimes frustrating, but I want to share with you one that has been, I think, very successful. And it's one I'm proud to have led, which is where back in 2013, 2014, we partnered with our National Treasury's Jobs Fund program. Now that invited innovation to job creation solutions. And we went to them and we said, it was a one-for-one matched principle. And we said, actually, we think if we put in place a guarantee mechanism to give comfort to our pension fund investors, we'll be able to leverage that 10 times, which we've done. So over time, with 150 million rands worth of guarantees, we've raised and continue to raise, our funds are not closed yet, about 1.5 billion rands. And that in turn has led to over 13,000 sustainable, decent, permanent jobs being created. And the key takeout actually from that is that what is crucial is that you have a capable state that oversees this process. So I have to, in and of ourselves as private sector, I don't believe we would have created the kind of quality jobs and sought those out and measured, evaluated, evidenced those if we hadn't been held to such high standards of accountability from National Treasury's Jobs Fund partners. So that's been a key learning for us as private sector. Another blended finance solution that I'm really happy to talk more about in Q&A is one that we're currently developing, and that's one in partnership with GFA, led by Jonathan First. Our proposal was the first SADC one to be awarded from the Global Climate Finance Lab, which is based out of the US. And it's focused on unlocking capital for the critical areas in water, sanitation, and health. So it's very relevant to this panel. the Finance Lab is funding us to develop a robust platform that enables the banks, the fund managers, the pension funds to align in funding, building, and managing critical water infrastructure across SADC. And we're targeting an initial capital raise of $125 million once we are endorsed, hopefully in September. And we think that this is a model that could be replicated in other sectors. Our industry body, SIDSSA, have also been quite involved in terms of advising us. And it's our intention that this is a platform that is used more broadly to raise infrastructure if we can prove concept here. But again, our key, from our experience, the key takeout is that for these solutions to bear fruit, they must be led by capable state functions that work collaboratively and flexibly with private sector and hold all parties to account. And so the last slide that I want to share with you is, I think, a piece of interesting research that I think is relevant in these blended finance private-public partnership, in terms of delivering infrastructure, like in the sectors we're talking about today. And it's some thinking from a prominent economist called Dani Roderick, who argues that we really need to shift away from traditional approaches to industrial policy more broadly, where typically governments assume that they're in control, or market failures up front, and we are prone to capture. They tend to approach solutions under this sort of traditional approach with quite rigid instruments and ideas. And instead, he advocates that in the real world, there's much uncertainty, of course, and changing circumstances. And so the more modern approach would be to assume that failures are actually largely unobservable. We don't have a crystal ball. There are multiple stakeholders with information, and that the state capacity itself is endogenous to the economy's workings. So in other words, and this is the critical requirement, we need a capable state. And then what he advocates is a really strong mirror in creating blended finance solutions, which we can certainly testify to, as the modern approach relies much more on the identification and objectives and constraints through strategic collaboration with firms, and then this very backwards and forwards iterative and collaborative behavior of learning, of cost discovery, of error detection. Certainly something that the process with partnering with our jobs fund has taught us. So in closing, I suppose time will tell, and I'm afraid this is a talk show, isn't it? I think we're all optimistic that we need to roll up our sleeves and really succeed at building these kind of blended finance solutions in effective and accountable partnerships in these much needed areas in order to propel our country onto the more sustainable and inclusive growth path that I think so many of us crave. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Heather, for that. And I guess a very interesting point there, which answers some of the earlier questions around how do we navigate some of the challenges around financing a much needed public infrastructure. And we also know that many of the delivery agents of this infrastructure, where it isn't undertaken by, I guess, regional boards or utilities, are often many of our district and local municipalities. And I think my next guest is the perfect person to speak to about some of the issues that have been raised by other colleagues on capacity, on project preparation, packaging, and all of the activities and processes across the entire continent of infrastructure investment. His name is Mr. Ndandazo Vimba. He's the CEO at the Municipal Infrastructure Support Agent. And Mr. Vimba, the platform is yours.
Thank you very much, Chair. Can I have the link, Chair, for the content? Thank you very much. I will preface my input, Chair, by raising some issues which I think are necessary for engagement today. The first issue, there is a common refrain, Chair, in this country that there is no shortage of money. We have got trillions and trillions of rands sitting with private sector. At the same time, is a complaint that there is a serious underinvestment on infrastructure. And the question is, what is the problem? Also, private sector will come and say, no, we need shovel-ready projects, we need finance-ready projects, and so forth and so forth. But Chair, if you look into the capacity of local government to be able to achieve all these expectations, you will agree with me that there is a lot that needs to be done to foster partnership between the state and local government. Just to make an example, Chair, on the issue of technical skills capacity that has been raised in local government, to effectively deliver infrastructure projects that are shovel-ready, infrastructure projects that are ready, that are bankable, Chair, you need some capacity in terms of engineering capacity. And currently, this capacity is not there in most of our municipalities. To illustrate the point of this problem, the 8 metros have engineers, that is your engineering professionals, your technologists and technicians, than all the 44 and 205 local municipalities combined. 1 metro alone has more engineering capacity than 5 provinces combined. And this is a serious challenge, Chair, that private sector, together with the state, must work together to address this particular challenge. Because MISA, as part of its own mandate, has deployed a number of engineers in some of these municipalities. But notwithstanding that, Chairperson, there is still a huge gap that I think we need as partners together with private sector to work together and make sure that this capacity is built. We can't expect that there will be projects that are shovel-ready, but we are not working hand to hand with municipalities to build capacity to prepare projects. So I'm challenging private sector that instead of saying, no, there is money, and however, there are no projects, the projects are there, but we need to prepare them. So challenging the chairperson, the private sector to think about this particular issue. We've got also instrument chairperson through our intergovernmental fiscal transfers that are there to support municipalities to deliver infrastructure. But if you look at these instruments, Chair, you will agree with me that they are no longer fit for purpose. You will have grants which in the main focuses on building new infrastructure. But if you look into what is the problem today, the real challenge that we're facing today is the access to safe, reliable, and accessible infrastructure. Meaning, we've got to move from backlog education and move towards making sure that we put at the front the asset management in this country. In other words, have more budget towards repairs and maintenance of infrastructure than it is currently the case. And as MISA, we've started some reforms in terms of our own municipal infrastructure grant to make sure that the grant is positioned to also look after the existing infrastructure. And also, Chairperson, the challenges have indicated of capacity in municipalities, in project management, and in terms of ensuring that we do proper planning and quality inspections. And we have set up now an inspectorate, which is comprised of chief engineers within MISA, working with a number of sector departments that conduct regular infrastructure audits in terms of the quality of the new infrastructure being built, as well as the quality, as well as the audits of the existing infrastructure, to make sure that we come up with some alternative technologies to assist in addressing in this respect. And also, Chairperson, we have a program that we have started together with private sector called Private Sector Participation Model. This is a partnership between government and private sector in the development of an interventionist model to solve the water and sanitation challenges in particular, and make sure that together with private sector, we are not just working in silos, and we have got a program that we put together. In this program already, Chair, we have got a steering committee that has put in place between government, which is coordinated by National Department of Cooperative Governance and hosted at MISA, as well as the private sector, your PPC, your SIDSSA, your PLSA, NPI, and BUSA. And the approach of this model is on the following, Chair, to ensure that there is involvement of private sector, not only from the financing perspective, but also from the implementation support perspective. And also the aim is to make sure that we do an effective gearing of the future government grant funding to ensure that infrastructure is properly constructed, operated, and maintained, and ensure that through these grants, we're able to crowd in private sector as well. There are challenges that I thought I need to reflect on. Challenge number one, Chairperson, the issue of ensuring access to safe and reliable water and affordable housing. And this is a very serious challenge, and if not urgently addressed, we will be failing to meet our constitutional obligations. We've seen a number of institutions taking government to court because of sewer spilling onto the river system and so forth. And this is a serious problem which is as a result of the underinvestment in water infrastructure, in particular the repairs and maintenance. Of course, we've got the issues around the unfavorable economic environment, which has been exacerbated by COVID-19, Chair, and this disproportionately borne more by the poor. And of course, the challenge of limited collaboration between public sector and private sector is another challenge. And through the district development model, we're looking at addressing this challenge and making sure that we collaborate with private sector, we collaborate with NGOs and the civil society in ensuring that we address the challenge of development in our country. Just to talk on the issue of the reliability and the challenges, Chair, firstly, if we were to address this particular problem, we need to acknowledge the fact that we have neglected and underinvested in existing infrastructure. And the point in case is the 141 water services authorities, which are spending far lower than what they are expected to spend on repairs and maintenance. For instance, including metros, all our municipalities are spending less than 1% on repairs and maintenance. Yet they are required in terms of the norm to spend at least 8% on repairs and maintenance. And I'm saying, Chairperson, this is a serious matter. If not addressed, we'll find ourselves in a serious situation. And we invite private sector to play a role in assisting us to address this particular problem. I've got a challenge, which is as a result of this underinvestment in repairs and maintenance of high non-revenue water in this country, which is costing us over 9.9 billion annually, which is a huge problem, which is as a result of the failing existing infrastructure due to leaks and so forth. And I can say that we no longer need to think in terms of backlog eradication terms, as I've indicated earlier, but change to a cradle to grave in terms of infrastructure development in our country. And we need to bring asset management to the forefront in local government and advocate and recognize the need to balance between investments in new and existing infrastructure. We are in the current crisis because this balance has not been struck historically, and we've got a problem. And we're saying we've got to drive a shift in infrastructure thinking through, of course, using the available instruments and to ensure that we address the challenges at hand and adopt a more agile and a flexible fiscal system, as I've indicated earlier, instead of focusing more on building new infrastructure, but be more flexible. If a municipality has got a challenge which around the new infrastructure, the municipality be allowed to prioritize the new infrastructure in using the grant system instead of being forced to budget from their own revenue, which unfortunately they do not have the revenue base. And of course, we have got to broaden our planning horizon to become a state that does not only think in 3 to 5 year cycles, which is currently the case, but takes a longer and more holistic view in infrastructure development. This assists Chairperson in terms of crowding in private sector, because currently we budget for MTAF for 3 years. And now you can't then use that investment to attract private sector, because private sector will then say, no, but I can't invest in a funding that is only available for 3 years. And we're saying we need to have a radical shift in terms of how we do our budgeting and have a more longer term view in terms of budgeting and allocate perhaps a municipality for 10 or 15 years, against which that grant municipality can then attract private sector to borrow to address the immediate challenges. And of course, national development plan and the national water and sanitation master plan provide already a starting point for this. And then another challenge, Chair, of the underinvestment and of course the challenges of coordination. The National Water Master Plan already indicates that there is already a shortfall of about 33 billion that is required for the next 10 years in each year to achieve water security in this country. This is a huge amount of money that is required. Now we need to then get to private sector. How can they close the gap that is there? Otherwise, the problem will continue if we don't work together. The state, of course, is responsible for creating an environment that can attract and sustain these sectors. And this must be done primarily by bringing stability into the sector. So we've got the responsibility as government to bring stability in local government, promote transparency, accountability, and predictability in how we do our business as local government. Of course, there are serious challenges, as the fellow panelists indicated, challenges of governance, challenges of mismanagement of funds, and as well as challenges of corruption in the system. We are saying this needs to be addressed by government and by fostering a culture of transparency and also a long-term planning and a discipline of execution in terms of our plans. And also the state, we need to build a foundation for investment. And one way of doing this is to structure, and indicated earlier, the state investment, which primarily is in the form of grants, to crowd in additional funding from private sector. And this, the state is making a sizable investment. Just in 2019 alone, Chair, is an allocation for water and sanitation and human settlement of 43 billion that goes to local government. And this is funding that can be leveraged and get private sector to borrow. They assist in making sure that we close the funding gap. We also need to think creatively, innovatively on the use of other funding avenues that are untapped. For instance, there is about 8.9 trillion rand sitting in institutional funding, like your pension funds, your retirement funds, mutual funds, retail funds, and so forth. Now, the issue of why there's so much money, but there's still a problem of underinvestment in local government. Of course, that needs to be done to relook into the regulatory environment, whether is it allowing for government to tap in into these funds. I was reading Regulation 28 of the Pension Fund Act, and I realized that there is a serious problem there because it promotes investment only in listed investments, and this is a challenge. So there is no promotion of investment by these funds through the socio-economic infrastructure. As a result, the more people who benefit from these funds are offshore investors, which is something that needs to be looked at and make sure that we reorientate our Pension Fund Act to look into how do we then invest locally instead of spending more of our funding offshore. So that is the input, Chair, and I have some rhetorical questions that I thought I need to raise to my fellow panelists. Legislatively speaking, to us, that are we really geared towards unlocking investment in water and sanitation? Do we address the issue of regulatory constraints that have been raised? And what are some success stories from other sectors that we could perhaps build on or learn from? And to what extent does this issue of limited technical capacity, which I raised in national, provincial, and local government, contribute to the problem? And how do we begin to resolve it collectively? And what is the role of the engineering fraternity in unlocking investment? Specifically, as government, we note that there is this perception that all is in the sole responsibility of the state, and professional bodies and associations, they exist here to criticize or invoice the state. How do we turn around this situation and make sure that we work together? And also how we foster better collaboration between the respective institutions represented here today to increase investment in water and human settlement infrastructure, so that the discussions held today don't just end here, but continue. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vimba there from the Municipal Infrastructure Support Agent. And I certainly hope all of the questions you're asking, not all of them are rhetorical, because it would be nice to hear some responses from some of our colleagues to some of the big issues that you're raising there, not only just from a funding perspective, but also, I guess, from institutionalized collaboration between the different parties on our call. Now, we're going to move swiftly along and get our last input before we have a few questions. And I'm quite conscious that we probably have, because we started at 10 past 2, we probably have about 25 minutes or so. And I guess once we get the input from Mr. Mfebe, we'll have an opportunity to engage some of the questions that have been coming through. And thank you to you all for sending through those questions, which have ranged from questions around bulk infrastructure right through to questions of water losses and non-revenue water, which are some of the issues that have been raised by some of our panelists. Mr. Mfebe, the platform is yours.
And I be given opportunity to share content.
Mr. Vimba, if you can pass the presenter's kosh or conch to Mr. Mfebe. I hate to call it a conch. I mean, if any one of us have read Lord of the Flies by I forget the guy's name, William Golding, you will certainly know what I'm talking about. Mr. Mfebe, I think you have the conch now. You may share your screen.
Passed it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vimba.
Thank you, Chair. Firstly, I would like to deal with the 5 key challenges, and I will go and finish off by concentrating on the true focus areas, value, success factors, and the role of government versus the private sector. Key challenge number 1 is corruption. South Africa is rated 70th in the world in terms of corruption. We need to move beyond the issue of commissions of inquiry and to get people to go to jail for their actions. And municipal and SOE governance in the water sector and sanitation remains a high risk in the realization of the NDP and the Sustainable Development Goals. Challenge number 2, serious interventions are needed to reduce demand by improving efficiency and in terms of the technologies and reducing losses, especially in the agricultural and urban sectors. You can see the 3 examples of what should be and what should not be. High demand system, drip system is okay, and vertical warehousing system. The key challenge number 3 is skill scarcity, and especially the ability of the water boards to manage the assets, and also the issue of the lack of skills at municipality level. Out of 278 municipalities in South Africa, there are only 202 civil engineers. Working conditions need to be addressed. The key challenge number 4 is that the municipal wastewater treatment plants are in a dilapidated state. They need to be rehabilitated. 56% of over 1,150 municipal wastewater works are in shambles. Key challenge number 5 is clean drinking water. 44% of 992 domestic wastewater treatment works are in poor conditions, and this translates into drinking water spilling into water ways and systems, and this problem excludes the private works and industrial treatment. We need to resolve the outstanding problems with relation to the Department of Water and Sanitation for economic projects, the water use licenses. For an example, the project under the Liberal Water Use Association, such as the Olifantsfontein Weir, Tupulukwane Pipeline, the Hope Dam, Flag Lishilo Dam, and water use license for the Limpopo Eco Industrial Park. But before I finish, I want to go back to the 3 areas that I talked about. Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you perfectly. Please go ahead, Mr.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes,
perfectly?
We can hear you.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. I thought because it was quiet.
No, please go ahead.
Okay, I need to go back to the 3 areas that I talked about. Value. Project must start with a clear understanding by all parties of the benefits it must achieve. We need to move beyond thinking of value for money as being the lowest tender price. The definition of value needs to be expanded to include issues such as whole life value, from cradle to grave, capital and operational carbon emissions, environmental issues should be considered, digital effectiveness, beam and data capture, fourth industrial revolution application, use of standard components and pre-manufactured elements, repetition manufacture offsite, especially for human settlements, collaborative behavior and supply chain integration, employer, contractor, supplier, fair appropriation of risk and reward, not one-sided, and the risk left with the contractor, social value of the construction process. There must be local benefit. Health and safety and well-being during the construction is of paramount importance. R&D and innovation, there is little or no R&D that takes place in the South African construction industry. Supply chain incentivization for delivery of innovation, sharing of innovation risk between client and supplier. We either innovate or evaporate. Government should have a set of cost and performance benchmarks for assets and contractors which represent best practice. Number two, on the issue of success factors, what makes a successful project? Creating demand through the short, medium, and long-term government project pipeline, which is credible and sustainable, and it needs to be open and transparent so that contractors can plan in advance for training, local involvement, etc. Not based on overly optimistic or distorted cost estimates or behavior that deliberately underestimates costs and overestimates benefits for strategic advantage. We need realistic budget. Stakeholders should be engaged at an early stage of the project to minimize scope creep and uncontrolled scope changes during implementation. That speaks to the issue I'm passionate about of early contractor involvement. Contractors are always left out of the planning stages until implementation stage when problems are being encountered due to going to market with projects that are premature and poorly designed. Sensible planning and programming is undertaken ahead of implementation. Realistic programs based on proper project preparation to de-risk projects and create investor appetite. Procurement documents are formatted and compiled in a standard manner with standard conditions of tender and forms of contract and establish requirements in a clear, unambiguous, comprehensive, and understandable manner. Standard inquiry documents. Standard forms of contract are used with minimal contact, amendments which do not change their intended use and shall only be amended when absolutely necessary to accommodate special needs. Appropriate contracting strategies and procurement tactics are aimed at best value procurement outcomes are employed. One size does not fit all. Payment in terms of the contract is made within 30 days as required by the Public Finance Management Act. Project bank accounts where the money is ring-fenced for the project only. The inherent project involvement in environment and institutional project risk, which are beyond the control of those who are tasked to physically deliver the project, are owed and are appropriately mitigated. Appropriate risk allocation, equitable risk allocation. Disputes between the parties to a contract are resolved quickly and at the lowest level. Remove bureaucracy from the procurement process. The new proposed procurement bill does just the opposite. Making a profit, of course, is not a swear word. The role of government, lastly, government needs to be capacitated to deliver infrastructure. Its track record is in this regard is very poor. We need private sector involvement. PPPs are critical in the delivery of infrastructure to relieve the fiscus from competing social demands. Only people with the requisite skill, pertinent experience, and knowledge must be placed in key positions. Award projects on design-build basis places the risk in the hands of the party best able to manage the risk. If you give the contractor the design and build, we can get Chris Campbell and the guys, and we know how to control them, not the government. The project owner appointed by government must be involved and engaged, and not just at the monthly site meetings. Regular project performance reporting, 2080 rule, periodic external independent reviews. Avoid a fractured team of owner, engineer, and contractor. We must be one team to deliver infrastructure, and we need to communicate honestly and open and often in order to deliver the projects effectively. Thank you.
Mr. Mfebe, thank you very much for those remarks, and I think they make for a perfect segue into, I guess, some of our own reflections of on the basis of some of the questions that have come through, which I would like for some of our panelists to engage. I'm also quite conscious of where we are in terms of time, and I want to maybe marry two different parts of our conversation, and that is to I guess allocate some of the questions and maybe where some of my panelists see their responses fit to maybe engage some of those questions. And I guess also, I mean, from my end, three related issues that I see. The first is that a lot of what we're talking about this afternoon is really about responding to different dimensions of what I would call our planetary crisis. And that might be climate change and attendant droughts right through to the challenge of pandemics that we find, and even moreover, some of the issues of corruption that we're talking about, really related to some of the social crises of greed and the kind of value systems that we've built. And so there's issues on that level, but also there's issues on a governance and an organizational level. And these are the issues of that Mr. Vimba was raising on a weak repair and maintenance of our infrastructure. One of the questions that has come through is what happens in many of the small towns where some of the pipe infrastructure that reticulates water from the treatment works through to our taps can't even take water anymore. Who finances the refurbishment of some of that infrastructure? And I think those are some of the critical questions that as we wrap up our conversations, I would like some of our panelists to respond to. And maybe the last issue really is about taking a long-term view and innovating and disrupting how we've done things for a very long period of time. And I think some of the calls that many have made for higher R&D, more innovation, and even thinking differently about our expenditure cycles to crowd in private investment, I think are critical questions that will allow us to not only expand infrastructure, but to think of it from cradle to grave, as many of our panelists have remarked today. So as we get some of the closing remarks, I just want to make a quick point that to all of my panelists, we've got about 10 minutes or so. We have already sort of run over time. And what I would like for us to do is for you to give us maybe 2 or 3 things that you think can be done in the immediate to ensure that we unlock all of the societal investment we can into water, human settlements, and sanitation infrastructure. And then, of course, also address in any meaningful way some of the questions that you can see in your Q&A panel there that you might think are relevant. And maybe if I can go through some of those. Question is around the closing funding space for many projects, bulk infrastructure. There's also questions, of course, around estimates of non-revenue water losses and costs. And then, of course, the issue of alternative building technology, because we have to think of all of these things in the context of that planetary crisis I was talking about earlier on. And then, of course, the issues of the sharing of skill and the financing and the role of pension funds as well. So, Desigan, let me start off with you, and I'll come back to Ntandazo and Heather. We'll also get some remarks from Chris as well and Webster. But Desigan, I'll start off with you. 2 or 3 things we can do in the immediate, and maybe your response to some of the issues is around innovation.
Thank you, Ayabongo, and thanks, colleagues, for those very interesting presentations. Let me preamble my response with something I've said on a few fora, that we continuously are trying to solve a 21st century challenge with, firstly, 20th century technology, and even worse, 19th century operating rules. We have simply not been dynamic in this domain, and it shows. What we have is a master plan. And the master plan, and the critique would be right if you said that the master plan includes everything, all of the interventions in a total composite. But the idea around pulling some things out and prioritizing that in the short term is an absolute. And the pitch that I would make is that we have to move outside the box. We have to move beyond that 20th century lock-in. So in the sanitation domain, for example, non-sewage sanitation should be the technology of choice that you can immediately organize to put on the ground. And it is the only way we're going to get to the SDG target. The second thing that I want to put in that place, using the same thing as an example, is that you have to have a multiplicity of benefits associated with the intervention. I mean, the current way we do sanitation is that, well, there's an end user benefit for the people who get the sanitation service, of course. But for the vendors, it's only about building the toilets and then maintaining them. It has to go beyond that. And there's been a powerful amount of work being done by a very smart international consortium of people, which includes many South Africans, around beneficiating that waste. Beneficiating that waste, firstly, with regards to energy. We know how we can use this in agriculture, but we've gone beyond that now. We've gone beyond that into the domain of extracting our proteins, high quality lipids, high quality chemicals from human waste. If you then use that as a capsule, then it's very easy for a multiplicity of measures to be met. You will provide the service in a sustainable way. You will be creating jobs in the way you develop out that maintenance and operation systems, like we've demonstrated in the WRC with social franchising. But over and above that, in addition to providing new opportunities for manufacturing bases for these new kinds of devices, you go into the domain of the beneficiation, and there's genuine profit to be made from beneficiating that waste. You know, the audience may not know this, but already in this country, we have demonstrator plants that are using soldier flies and pulling out liquid fuel, biofuel from human waste for use. So, you know, if you have that total system approach around industrialization, we could almost immediately go into a beneficiation phase in a matter of months, not more than a year, actually. So there's a huge opportunity waiting just outside the doorstep.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll stop there for
yes,
now.
again, thank you very much for that. We'll have to leave it there. Mr. Vimba, let me bring you in here just on some of the questions. I mean, one of the questions was really around, you know, how do we sort of rope in and I guess overcome some of the considerable constraints from a short-term banking funding and also long-term return, I guess, for pension funds, which is related to the issue that you were raising. How do we effectively, I guess, de-risk from a capacity perspective some of the projects that we find in many of our municipalities?
Thank you very much.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Mr. Facilitator. I think the first thing which I think is very critical for me is for the state to acknowledge the fact that we have got to change our fiscal system. And that for me is very important. Make it attractive for private sector to come and invest. For instance, indicated earlier, the issue of budgeting for 3 years, I don't think it's sustainable, and it's not attractive to private sector. And how do we then attract private sector against the investment that we're making? Because we're talking about the blended finance. How do you achieve blended finance if your intergovernmental fiscal transfers are not geared towards attracting private sector? That's for me, that's the first thing that I think we need to tackle and make sure that we use the grant system that we have in such a way that it is easy for private sector to use it to project in terms of whether they should invest in that particular municipality or not. Currently, many of our municipalities will agree with me, they are not credit worthy, and they don't have any revenue base, they don't have any strong balance sheet, and the only thing they have is the intergovernmental fiscal transfers from national government. And how do we then make sure that we use that lever that we have to get private sector involved? So that's the first point. I think it's very important.
Yes. No, I think that point is well made, and we're going to have to maybe pause you on that point because I want to give some of the other panelists an opportunity. So I'll have to pause you there, but I think it's a perfect segue to my question for you, Heather Jackson from Ashburton Investments. And And I guess it's related to the point that Mr. Vimba was making, which is that if we continue with business as usual, you might end up having a lot of private sector money following projects into the metros and effectively not financing projects where they need it the most, especially if those projects don't have a cost recovery component, which is what many of your investors would want, right? They would want some predictable cash flows to finance their interest or coupon payments or whatever obligations are due to them. What are some of the things we can do for infrastructure that might not have a cost recovery component in the immediate to crowd in private sector investment there in a way that is meaningful, but where we can effectively share some of the risks and the costs involved?
Sure. For that, and yes, it's a very vexed issue that one's trying to solve for here. I think there are 2 points that I'd like to make. The one is that in terms of attracting private funding, and when we say private funding, we must also remember that if we're talking, for example, about pension funds or insurance schemes, the underlying owners of those are actually you and me. So it's all South Africans. And so the first point to make is that there is a fiduciary responsibility to safeguard those returns. You know, this is not kind of a free piggy bank. And so you do need to find those investments that do have qualified risk return profiles, of which there are many. And so I think that's the starting point. The starting point is to draw in those investors into credible investment opportunities that are credit enhanced, you know, that have this concessional or subordinated layer in terms of the blended finance, the guarantee mechanism, or whatever it is. There are lots of ways of solving for that. That's, you know, to actually encourage what is quite a reluctant savings industry. They've you know, many feel they've had their fingers burnt somewhat. So I think the other very important thing for government is to, and Mr. Vimba touched on it now, is to signal adequately from government that, you know, this is business unusual now, and that the kinds of constraints, be they regulatory or whatever, are actually going to be dealt with, and signal that strongly. Another really important one is the REAP program. Get it back up and running. It was great. You know, so there's some pretty powerful, simple fixes that I believe are possible.
Okay, thank you so much for that. Let me bring in Mr. Campbell, and I think you would have certainly had some comments. What are some of the, I guess, 2 or 3 things? Maybe let me not give you 1, because yeah, I mean, I'm sorry.
I think you've run out of time. No, I'm fully appreciate that.
Yes. I mean, just one thing that you think in the immediate can be done to catalyze investment in the space.
I think the one most important thing is that, in fact, I'm going to take license. It's 2 rolled into 1. So this is a good talk. I heard Heather say this is a talk shop. I'd hate to think this is a talk shop. I think it's the beginning of an action. So we need now to be the bird that flies off the wire, not the bird deciding to fly and still being on that wire 10 years later. And secondly, it is the one opportunity for us as a country, as a collective patriot citizenry, either in government or private sector, to get our country on track and rebuild the trust deficit that has unfortunately happened over time.
Thank you very much for that brief input, Mr. Mfebe. Let me bring you in here. You made an interesting point about retrofitting for purpose some of our human settlements in terms of the just transition, but also in terms of connectivity. And I'm quite interested in the one thing that you think can be done to achieve that outcome, but also in the aggregate, much better outcomes in public-private partnerships that we've seen in the past.
Is an ample opportunity for the private and the public sector to work together using proven technological and innovative processes. I've referred to, for an example, the issue of building a decent human settlement using 3D technology, prefabrication of units, not building on site. It makes quicker production of houses at a very short time, at a very a low cost instead of traditional methods. We have to reimagine the way in which we deliver infrastructure. But part of that reimagination will not be possible if you still have people still trapped in the quagmire of antiquated thinking, who are still invested in control. And you need, therefore, to fix the SOE and municipal governance. That is where a lot of infrastructure is failing at that level. And that takes us to the issue also of the water boards. You need to put people who are fit for purpose in order to deliver this infrastructure, to make it attractive to all of us.
All right,
And
Mr. Febe, I think the point is well made. We have to fix SOE governance, municipal governance. We have to sort out the water boards, and I guess facilitating partnerships as well. I'm sorry to cut you off like that, but unfortunately we're closely running out of time, which leaves me with 2 minutes for Mr. Tati. Sizwe Tati, one of the first questions we got was actually directed at you, and it was a question saying, given the funds from the National Treasury and the limits in this regard, and I made the point earlier on of the non-compensation baseline reductions that came through in the February budget, which we might expect in the budget over the next 24 hours or so. How do you see the private sector funding some of these projects, and maybe some closing remarks from the department reflecting on the conversations we've had for the last 2 hours or so?
Thank you, Ayabonga. On the broader budget shortfall question, let me reflect firstly on what is happening intragovernmentally. That we know the impact of COVID, I don't have to repeat, but greater effort today is really looking at where are the budget chunks sitting within each family. Within human settlement, water and sanitation, we're looking at, there are multiple institutions within these departments. How can we leverage on each other's balance sheets? Some of the balance sheets are under-leveraged, they're under-resourced. There are those that are typically standing in good position and with very advanced projects that are ready for implementation. So the minister is pulling together these institutions to begin to talk to one another. And there are broader challenges. I'm not going to waste time to everybody about that. The third layer, second layer is really looking at areas where there's under expenditure, where funds have been set aside for whatever plans that were in the beginning. Where there's underutilization is to realign those to areas of priority. And then, of course, what the national government and other institutions at institutional level is looking into international funding agencies. So there's a serious effort really to look into that shortfall in broad terms. There was another point which relates to the underutilization of professionals. Sitting where I am, I tend to be confused because I read documentation based on research that talks to shortage of skills, broadly in the sector, and then I understand the shortage of skills within the state, which is abundant in the private sector. I'm not sure where the reality sits now when I'm hearing there's some unemployed capacity, and I don't want to push back. The message I would leave is that the moment these mega catalytic projects kickstart, I bet you these skills will be drawn into those segments in large numbers. And of course, the challenge really is to kickstart these projects and ensure that they move. We know very well, because the question links to private sector. It normally will not come in until government takes a lead not so much in the capacitation of the project, but in mitigating the risks, in taking a position which otherwise a private sector investor would not have. There were talks here about cushioning the pension funds, putting guarantees around them. The apex institution that's envisaged within human settlement is wanting to do exactly that. How do we de-risk the project? How do we cushion private sector so that its risk perception on each one of these is not as high as it would be if the government was not there? So the government will have to play a leading role. That's what the apex institution is looking at. Maybe let me jump, because I've got a few comments, but I don't want to take the time. If you listen very well, Ayabong, consistently in all our presentation, we talk about the need to capacitate the state. But quite frankly, let's look at these things. The common touch points in all of them is local government. You will never run any infrastructure project unless it has gone through one point of decision-making by local government. If I were to make strong suggestions to our own government is to reorientate this thing, to deploy the highest levels of skills at the local government level, and make sure that we attract that talent and keep it there and avoid the historical gaps that have happened. I will say it here, but I'm not sure I'll be popular because I'm representing the minister. A lot of journalists have written about the cadre deployment, that it doesn't help in the delivery system. The state needs to look at how do we some of the panelists have mentioned, put people who are fit for purpose, people who are well qualified to execute on the job. Unless that area of the fundamental delivery, which my minister, I know every time there are questions being asked, she says, please understand, national government is doing a separate role in relation to what the local government. When people are talking about there's no water in rural areas, the delivery agent of the state is local government. So in all of these areas where we talk today of the problems that are experienced on the ground, local government has got a touch point. I think to me that's a big takeout in this conversation, that if infrastructure has to be unpacked and roll out in a sustainable fashion as we envisage, let's fix and take a leadership at the local government level. Thank you.
Okay. And Tati, I think many of your colleagues in the presidency and at COGTA would be happy with you for your plug there of, I guess, the need for the district development model, because effectively that's what you've done. I mean, that's the rationale for why we need all tools on deck or all hands on deck where the delivery happens and where the delivery agents are. And I think the picture painted by many colleagues of what is taking root at that level is probably in the immediate where we ought to be intervening. And I think many of my colleagues in another discussion on the district development model will be picking up some of those issues. But I want to take this opportunity to maybe close our conversations. We probably run over by about 10 minutes or so, and I really appreciate the indulgence and the patience of many of my panelists who have given of their time, their expertise. And thank you very much to all of you, Sizwe, Desigan, Chris, Webster, and Dandas or Heather. Thank you very much to all of you for taking time to speak to us. Big thank you to Andisani for moderating some of the questions that have come through, and everybody who sent through questions and participated in the session. I think we had about 80-something participants in this conversation at its height, and that I guess speaks volumes of the interest of many South Africans in this conversation. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you all for joining us for this conversation, and may the conversation long continue. I think the conversation cannot end here, and it's important that, as Mr. Webster was saying, that we continue to communicate, and we do so frequently and consistently, because that's what's going to make and give meaning to many of the partnerships that we've been talking about here, which in no stretch of the imagination are only just about money. So thank you very much to my panelists, and thank you to the Department of Human Settlements, Water and Sanitation for putting this together. Putsizwe, you'll send our regards to Minister Sisulu, and our message that may the conversation long continue beyond this. Thank you.
Thank you, Abong. Well done.
Thank you. Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Panelists.
Very much. Thank you.
Thank you.